Have you ever considered how the world perceives missionaries? Depending on their denomination, the reception can differ greatly. Today, we tackle the recent criticism targeted at Amazon evangelical missionaries. These missionaries are often accused of destroying indigenous culture. However, is this criticism fair or just a result of reigning Catholic sentiment? Amazon evangelical missionaries, for instance, find themselves under a microscope of scrutiny. They face criticism for their methods, their beliefs, and even their very presence in remote communities. Critics argue that they disrupt traditional cultures and impose their beliefs on others. However, this video will present a counter-argument, showing that their work is benign and positive. Contrast this with Catholic missionaries, who often receive praise for their work. They are seen as pillars of community development, educators, and bearers of peace. The Catholic Church's long-standing history and vast resources often shield its missionaries from the same level of criticism faced by their evangelical counterparts. Before we dive into the complexities of media control and bias, let's take a moment to understand the differences between non-Catholic or evangelical churches and Catholic churches. This will help us better understand the contrasting perceptions surrounding their respective missionaries. Firstly, there are theological differences. While both Catholic and evangelical churches follow the teachings of Christ, they interpret these teachings differently. For instance, Catholics believe in the authority of the Pope and the necessity of the sacraments, while evangelicals emphasize personal faith and Bible reading. Secondly, there are differences in practices and traditions. Catholic churches are known for their structured liturgical worship and their use of symbols and rituals, while evangelical worship is often more informal and focused on the preaching of the Bible. Lastly, it's important to note that evangelical is a broad term that encompasses a wide range of beliefs and organizations. There are many forms of evangelicalism, each with its own distinct practices and views. This diversity within evangelicalism often leads to different approaches to missionary work. Understanding these differences is crucial to understanding the complex dynamics surrounding missionary work. It helps us form a balanced view, taking into account all the factors that influence our perception of these missionaries. Now let's move on to explore the role of media control and bias in the next scene. Before we delve deeper into the historical footprint of evangelical missionaries, let's now delve into the role of media control and bias in these countries, especially when it comes to matters of religion. The Catholic Church, due to its long-standing history and vast resources, has control over much of the media in these countries. This control often influences the narrative and the perception of the Church's activities, including those of their missionaries. On the other hand, foreign reporters who travel to these regions often have contact with Catholic entities, but rarely with local evangelical churches. This biased access to sources inevitably skews the reporting and the perception of evangelical missionaries, often painting them in a less favorable light. Moreover, the evangelical churches, unlike the Catholic Church, lack the media connections to counterbalance the negative bias or reinforce any positive bias. This lack of media control and the resultant bias further complicates the perception of evangelical missionaries. Understanding the role of media control and bias is crucial to understanding the complex dynamics surrounding missionary work. It helps us form a balanced view, taking into account all the factors that influence our perception of these missionaries. Now let's move on to the historical footprint of evangelical missionaries in the next scene. Before we dive further into the discussion, let's take a look at the history of evangelical missionaries in the Amazon and other South Central American indigenous communities. The arrival of these missionaries often marked a significant shift in the lives of the indigenous people. They brought with them their faith, their values, and their way of life, which profoundly influenced the communities they served. However, their interactions with these communities were not always positive. There were instances of cultural imposition, conflicts, and even devastation of local traditions. Understanding this history is crucial to forming a balanced view of their work. In the next scene, we will discuss the current state of missionary work in these regions. Now, let's turn our focus to the present day. The missionary work in indigenous communities in South and Central America is primarily led by various Christian denominations, each with their unique doctrines and beliefs. Their missions often aim to spread their faith, provide education, and assist in community development. The nature of these missions varies widely, some being more respectful and adaptive to local traditions than others. These missions work by establishing a presence within the communities, often through building churches or schools, and by interacting directly with the people. They engage in teaching, healthcare provision, and various forms of community service. However, the way these missions interact with indigenous communities is a topic of much debate. Many argue that while they bring some benefits, their presence can also lead to cultural erosion, conflicts, and a loss of traditional knowledge. Understanding the current state of missionary work is key to forming a balanced view of their impact. In the next scene, we will delve deeper into the controversies and criticisms surrounding these missions. However, like any other institution, missionary work is not without its challenges. While the intentions might be noble, the execution can sometimes be fraught with issues of authoritarianism, conservatism, and cultural bias within the missionary community. Some missionaries, in their zeal to spread their faith, have been accused of forcing indigenous communities to abandon their cultural traditions, labeling them as sinful or primitive. This often leads to a loss of cultural identity and a sense of displacement among the indigenous people. Further, the adoption of foreign languages is another contentious issue. There are instances where indigenous languages have been replaced with Spanish, Portuguese, English, or French, leading to a gradual erosion of the native languages and consequently, the cultural heritage tied to them. These issues highlight the need for a more nuanced understanding of missionary work and its impact on indigenous communities. It's crucial to ensure that the benefits brought by these missions do not come at the expense of the cultural identity and autonomy of the indigenous communities. In our next scene, we will explore possible solutions and the future of missionary work. Now let's delve deeper into what constitutes a regular day for a missionary working in a far-flung area. The process of hiring these missionaries is strict and meticulous, demanding not merely a profound faith but also an authentic regard for different cultures, the ability to adapt, and resilience. The selection factors often encompass a mix of spiritual, emotional, and physical fitness. Once they are on the field, the day for a missionary is anything but ordinary. It typically commences with a personal prayer and reflection, succeeded by community service such as imparting education, providing medical help, or aiding construction work. However, it's important to understand that missionary work primarily about serving the community, a labor of love with little tangible reward. Their work goes beyond teaching religion. It is fundamentally about serving, about sharing faith through actions and service, not through forced conversion. They devote a considerable part of their day in engaging with the local community, gaining insights into their culture and traditions, and appropriately sharing their own faith. The labor, though, can be both physically and emotionally taxing. Living in isolated areas often implies grappling with harsh living conditions, solitude, and a lack of basic amenities. But it is not devoid of its own gratifications. Many missionaries derive pleasure in altruistically serving others and forging profound relationships with the local community. They also find satisfaction in witnessing the positive transformations that their work ushers in, be enhanced literacy rates, improved healthcare, or a fortified sense of community. Comprehending the day-to-day life of a missionary can offer invaluable understanding of their work and its influence on the communities they aid. It further highlights the necessity for a more compassionate and respectful approach to missionary work, one that acknowledges and safeguards the cultural heritage of indigenous communities while sharing the message of faith. While missionary work has its supporters, it also faces significant opposition. This opposition comes from various groups, including indigenous rights activists, secularists, and other religious groups. Critics argue that missionary work can disrupt indigenous cultures and impose foreign beliefs, potentially leading to cultural erasure. For instance, indigenous rights activists express concern that the introduction of new religious beliefs can lead to a loss of traditional customs and values. Secularists, on the other hand, may question the premise of religious conversion itself, arguing for a world where individuals are free to choose their own beliefs without external influence. Similarly, other religious groups may oppose missionary work out of a desire to protect their own faith traditions. Behind most of these claims, there seems to be a significant influence of the Catholic Church, which greatly fears people leaving them for other churches or religions. In a surprising twist, the Catholic Church often finds itself aligned with left-wing politics, despite the conservative nature of most Catholics, especially those controlling the church. This connection has its roots in the Church's long history of social activism and its teachings on issues such as poverty and social justice. In the midst of this, it's worth noting that the notion that indigenous and other people of these countries should remain Catholic has not been widely criticized by Western liberals, even those who typically adopt an anti-Christian stance. This could stem from the perception that Catholics are inherently better than evangelicals. It's important to challenge this stance, as in reality, they could be worse. Critics often fail to understand the breadth and depth of indigenous cultures. In stark contrast to the forced conversions of Catholicism imposed on indigenous peoples through military might and colonial laws, evangelical faith has been adopted willingly. Indigenous communities are not mindless victims, but active participants who consciously choose to accept or reject new religious ideas. This is a crucial component in understanding the complex dynamics surrounding missionary work and the challenges that missionaries face in their efforts to spread their faith. It offers a different perspective, one where the indigenous communities are not just passive receivers, but active participants in religious transformations. Inexplicably, many Western evangelical churches have practically sided with the Catholics in this matter. Instead of supporting the evangelical missions that align more closely with their own faith and values, they choose to back Catholic-run indigenous charities. One may wonder why this is so. It could be that these evangelical churches are more comfortable with the familiar structure and organization of Catholic charities. Or perhaps they are influenced by the dominant narrative that portrays Catholic missionaries in a more favorable light. This surprising alignment has significant implications for evangelical missions and the indigenous communities they serve. It can lead to a reduction in resources and support for evangelical missions, which can hamper their work and impact the communities that rely on them for spiritual guidance and practical support. Let's now delve into the role of indigenous leaders in the criticism of non-Catholic churches. There have been instances where indigenous leaders, sometimes with little or no connection to the specific community in question, have been reported to spread negative remarks about non-Catholic churches. These instances raise questions about the authenticity of these claims and the need for transparency in these matters. It's crucial to verify these claims and understand the motivations behind them. The impact of these unverified statements can be significant, potentially harming the reputation of non-Catholic churches and influencing the perception of their missionary work. Understanding the role of indigenous leaders and their influence on the perception of non-Catholic churches is crucial to understanding the complex dynamics surrounding missionary work. In our next scene, we'll delve into how this dynamic affects missionaries on the ground and the ways they navigate these challenges to continue their work. Let's now explore how Catholics and reigning leftists have always shown a special interest in indigenous and minority groups. It's not uncommon to see these factions manipulate these communities, often finding them easier to control due to the socio-economic vulnerabilities they face. This manipulation often involves the weaponization of the rightful plight for recognition of these groups, against problems that were, ironically, mostly caused by Catholics and leftist governments. These issues include land disputes, cultural erasure, and economic marginalization, among others. In a twist of irony, these groups often accuse evangelicals of the very tactics they employ. They charge evangelical missionaries with cultural imperialism and erasure, while conveniently overlooking their own historical and ongoing infringements on the rights and cultures of these indigenous and minority groups. This manipulation and weaponization of indigenous and minority groups by Catholics and leftists is a crucial aspect to consider when evaluating the criticism against evangelical missionaries. It not only highlights the complex dynamics at play, but also underscores the need for a more nuanced understanding of the issues involved. In the next scene, we'll delve deeper into the government's role in this intricate web and how these dynamics impact missionary work. Let's now delve into the role of government and other groups in striving to put a halt to these missions. Over the years, a host of governments and organizations have put measures in place to prevent these missions, citing reasons like cultural preservation and safeguarding of indigenous rights as their motive. These measures have come in the form of legislations, restrictions, and even direct interventions. Interestingly, certain countries such as Brazil and Peru have enacted laws preventing missionaries from visiting indigenous territories. This approach, while aimed at preserving the indigenous people's way of life, has sparked intense debates. Critics argue that these laws are not only humiliating and dehumanizing to these indigenous communities, but also project the notion that they are immature and incapable of making their own decisions. Despite these numerous hurdles, numerous missions have proven their resilience, adapting and finding ways to proceed with their work. Some have sought to operate within the boundaries of these regulations, while others have leveraged technology and social media to reach their intended audiences. Furthermore, a continuous attempt to engage in dialogue with governments and organizations is made, aiming to find some common ground and address concerns. Nonetheless, these challenges have ignited conversations about potential solutions. Some individuals suggest a more collaborative approach, proposing that missions work closely with indigenous communities while respecting their cultures. Others advocate for stricter regulations or even a complete stoppage of certain missionary activities. As we look ahead, the future of missionary work hangs in the balance. In the midst of the ongoing debates and challenges, it's important to note that not all of these missions are entirely benign. There are a multitude of churches involved, each with their own unique practices and belief systems. Some of these churches, unfortunately, have acted in exploitative and deceptive ways towards the indigenous tribes they were supposed to help and guide. One such issue is the advocacy for a pro-Israel standpoint, which is sadly reflective of much of the international evangelical community. This controversial stance has led to further divisions and conflicts, exacerbating the already complex situation. However, it's unfair to paint Catholics as saviors, absolving them of any guilt or exploitation. The Catholic Church, like any other religious institution, has had its fair share of controversies and scandals throughout. To ignore this would be to paint an incomplete and biased picture of the situation. While there are indeed issues within the evangelical community, it's crucial to remember that no religious group is without its flaws. Finally, let's take a look at the Catholic Church, one of the wealthiest and most powerful organizations in the world. The Catholic Church utilizes a significant portion of its wealth to maintain its image and to influence key individuals, subtly encouraging them to sing praises for the Church itself. While their influence in English-speaking other worldwide countries may seem minimal, they have a strong control over the media coverage in Latin America, often ensuring it's skewed in their favor. Furthermore, this influence of the Catholic Church significantly impacts the international coverage of any event or issue in Latin America. Due to the scarcity of other reliable sources in the region, the Church's narratives often dominate the news. Consequently, Catholics are often portrayed in a positive light, regardless of the context or circumstances. This is especially noticeable and striking in countries where such favorable representation of religious entities is not the usual practice. As we conclude this exploration, let's look towards the future with hope. The rich and diverse cultures of indigenous tribes are an invaluable part of our world's heritage. These cultures, steeped in centuries of tradition and wisdom, deserve to be preserved and respected. Communities should have the autonomy to determine their own futures, free from outside influence. They should be able to choose their own paths, hold on to their traditions, and make decisions that best serve their people. The role of missionaries, governments, and global communities is not to dictate, but rather to support these goals. Missionaries can focus on providing aid and education without imposing their beliefs. Governments can enforce laws that protect indigenous rights. The global community can put their considerable resources to work, helping these indigenous communities to break free from the remnants of colonial oppression. It's time to support these communities as they reclaim their rights, heal from the past, and assert their autonomy. As we move forward, let's keep this hope alive, advocating for respect, understanding, and autonomy for all indigenous communities.